This is Harrison's lookout. This is where he spent endless hours watching and waiting for people to come up the grade. What's fascinating about this very spot is it took 3 days for people to make the trek from San Diego to Escondido, from Escondido to Tin Can Flats at the bottom of the mountain, and then a final 3rd day to make it all the way up here. One can't help but wonder what went through Harrison's mind as he squatted here and watched and waited for visitors. Harrison, former slave from the South, survived the gold rush, survived sundown towns in Southern California, and ended up here at this most defensible and most beautiful spot. But this wasn't where he chose to build his cabin. Over 500 feet away from where Harrison had his lookout and watched visitors ascending the mountain, he built his one-room cabin. But don't let the current look of it fool you. This was buried, totally buried under dirt, and we had to excavate it a few inches at a time, and the mystery was solved when we ended up seeing the foundation of this 11-foot square cabin. And what's so fascinating about this is this perfectly resembles slave quarters from the South, and yet Harrison, a former slave, chose to build this slave quarters in San Diego. After we figured out where Harrison was living, next we turned our attention to how he was living. In effect, we moved from the known to the unknown. And that's where we put in this archaeological grid. You see all these strings that frame 5-foot squares. And we dug them down a few inches at a time to keep track of what artifacts were in what area. And what that told us was that this patio area was where kitchen activities were going on. Lots of cans and bottles. But over here, this was the trash dump. Now, we'll call them midden and other fancy archaeological terms, but it's where all the animal bones and other remains were just tossed outside. All right, so once the archaeologist puts away the fedora, the bullwhip, stops battling rattlesnakes, we get down to the actual excavation process. And that's where we use these little shovels, trowels, and we start scraping away the dirt. Just a little bit at a time. And you never know what you're gonna find. It's a little bit like fishing. If you try too hard, you won't get anything. But hey, look at that. So really closely here, we have a nice piece of glass, part of a bottle. If you look really closely, you can see a little bit of a pink purple hue to it. This glass was made with manganese, and that gives us a nice date, late 19th, early 20th century. And one of the most exciting things about this piece of glass is not what it is, but the direction it's pointing us. The scatter tells us there's more in this direction. And the question remains, what could be over there? It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that Harrison was the first person on Palomar Mountain. He wasn't. The Luiseno Indians have been here for thousands of years, and it's evinced in this spectacular bedrock milling station. If you look really closely, you can see we have evidence here of thousands of years of grinding stone activity, grinding the acorns into mush. Now, Harrison both petitioned the U.S. government for this property, he homesteaded it, but he also was given the property by the Luiseno Indians. And what this means is he had an agreement with them where it was his land, but they would still have access to this site and this land. And that leads to this broader implication of how close he was with the native population. At different times, he had married 2 different indigenous women. Now, when we look at this particular site area, this was a social area as well as an activity area. When we find a bedrock milling station, they are always beneath beautiful trees and have this scenic outlook. It's essential that we remember that the Luiseno Indians were here for thousands of years before Harrison, and they'll be here long after.